Hello, everybody. My name is Stefan Reichelstein. I'm at the University of Mannheim in Germany and also at the Stanford Business School. And I'm glad to contribute this academic spotlight on the topic of corporate carbon disclosures. So for some time now, firms have been required to report and disclose their carbon footprint, their CO2 emissions, to regulators in the US and in Europe. One of the innovations in the area of mandatory disclosure has been that in 2013, the British government required firms headquartered in Britain to disclose that overall their aggregate Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions in their annual reports. There has been some research done on this that has come to the conclusion that this regulation, which basically forced firms to aggregate their distributed disclosures in their annual reports, already had a so-called real effect in that the treated firms in Britain appear to reduce their emissions more than a comparison group of firms in other European countries not subject to the regulation. Where we've really seen quite a bit of action in the last couple of years is in the area of voluntary disclosures. And many of you probably have seen yet another global corporation, I'm listing a few at the bottom of the slide here, make a pledge, a commitment to reduce their carbon footprint, their emissions to zero, usually by the year 2050 or somewhere around there. Obviously, these are important disclosures in that firms are basically telling the public that they view climate change as one of the more pressing issues, and they are prepared to do their share in reducing overall emissions in the world. The observation to us is that these disclosures, the members of this net zero by 2050 club, their disclosures vary a great deal in terms of scope and specificity. So first, there is the question, how is carbon footprint measured? And we already see considerable variation on that front. Generally, you can think of a carbon footprint measure as being the difference between gross emissions and offsets, credits, if you want to. When it comes to gross emissions, there is already considerable variation, once again, to the extent that some firms limit their measure to so-called Scope 1 emissions. Others include Scope 1 and 2, and yet others follow the prescriptions in the International Greenhouse Protocol by saying we are also including at least parts of our Scope 3 emissions. As you know, Scope 3 emissions are inherently fuzzy in terms of what you include and how far up the supply chain you go, or in the other direction, how far you go in trying to measure and include the emissions associated with the products that you are selling to customers. Overall, Scope 3 emissions and also Scope 2, of course, have always the issue of double counting across the entire economy, the world economy. It gets even more complicated over on the offset side. So here we typically distinguish so-called removal versus avoidance offsets. A removal offsets in its simplest form is where the firm can claim, because of our action, a ton of CO2 was removed from the atmosphere. In contrast, avoidance offsets work such that one argues that because of my action, another party in the world did not emit a ton of CO2, and that's why we're claiming this as a credit against our carbon footprint. There's a lot of discussion nowadays about avoidance offset, how meaningful they are, how they are included. And to give you one indication of how difficult this has become, avoidance offset at the moment on the voluntary carbon markets trade for an amount somewhere in the range of $3 per ton. So there's ample supply, and this market is growing very quickly because lots of companies are acquiring these so-called avoidance offsets. One other observation, avoidance offsets or offsets in general are of course also pretty powerful in terms of firms being able to claim already today, when they are not carbon neutral in the aggregate, that certain select products are already carbon neutral just by doing a suitable allocation of carbon offsets to a particular product line. So bottom line here, tremendous variation in terms of what's being measured and the specificity of the pledge that has been made. One of the things that's also striking about many of these announcements, disclosures, is that they pertain to the year 2050. And it's of course clear to everybody that a goal that is set 30 years out is far beyond the accountability horizon of current executives. So what we are arguing here is it would be great if we had a more standardized reporting framework here, and that would be more informative to the public in terms of seeing who is actually doing what in this space. And the first step on this would be to include milestones on the path, say, towards 2050. In an example that I'll give in a moment, this could go, say, every 10 years. You could have a milestone with the company reporting, okay, this is what we would like to be doing in 10, in 20, and in 30 years. If you do that, you get, of course, into issues of having to define a carbon intensity measure because you want to account for growth in the operations, mergers that firms may be going through. And then it's the question, what is that carbon intensity metric? Going a step further, we believe that when it comes to ultimately to climate change, it is really a metric that we call here net direct emissions. That is the variable of interest. So what are we including here? Well, direct emissions, scope 1 by the firm, and direct removals that qualify as being sufficiently durable, say 150 years. So you can say we're removing a ton of CO2 and we're storing it, and it can be certified that this will not reach the atmosphere within, say, 100 or 150 years. If you sum up all of these net direct emissions by all economic entities, firms and consumers, over time and across entities, then you're actually getting a measure of what is being added in terms of CO2 to the atmosphere. So I mentioned milestones already, every 10 years. That would make, in my mind, the entire disclosure process more transparent. And furthermore, these projections should be met in our minds with annual reports of the actual net direct emissions achieved by the firm. You can then, over time, basically create a time-consistent reporting framework by allowing people to compare what was forecast at different points in time versus what has been achieved up to that point. So in general, such a framework should allow the public to gain a lot more information in terms of stated ambitions and delivered performance over time. So I have illustrated this idea here in a picture, and as so often a picture tells 1,000 words. Look on the green trajectory as the original 2020 projection, followed then by an update in the year 2025 in red. And you can see that in the interim years, actual emissions may not have followed at all the initial projection. The firm then uses its revised information and its revised forecast to say, where are we going to be, where are we going to go from here on? That would be the red trajectory. And you see in my example, it may well be then that the firm actually over-delivers over the next 5 years before it issues the next forecast. Such a framework, as I said before, would allow for an apples to apples comparison, both in terms of the metric of what's being measured, and it would be time consistent. Having such a framework would, I think, generate a lot more valuable information and make it possible for the public and policymakers to see whether the world is really on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.